The crystal chandeliers of the opulent hotel lobby seemed to swim before her eyes, their light fracturing into 1,000 dizzying points. Ilara tightened her grip on the single piece of paper in her hand, a letter she had spent the afternoon, writing her words full of hope and the nervous excitement of a surprise. Her other hand rested on the pronounced curve of her belly, where the twins, her daughters, were stirring in a restless, rhythmic dance. She had missed Julian terribly during his week-long business trip, and the idea of welcoming him home a day early had felt like a perfect burst of romantic spontaneity. As the hotel manager, a kind-faced man named Mr. Henderson, had just confirmed his room number with a discreet smile, assuming she was part of the plan. She moved through the lavishly decorated lounge towards the terrace bar, her heart fluttering like a captured bird. And then she saw him, her Julian. His back was to her, his familiar frame outlined against the setting sun that poured gold over the city's skyline. A smile, wide and genuine, began to spread across her face. It faltered, then died completely as her mind processed the scene. He was not alone. A woman with sleek dark hair was nestled close to him, her body angled towards his in a way that spoke of deep familiarity. She was saying something, her lips close to his ear, and he threw his head back and laughed, a sound Ilara had always thought belonged only to her. Then, with a naturalness that stole the air from Ilara's lungs, he leaned in and kissed her. It was not a brief peck. It was a slow, lingering kiss, the kind shared by those who have nothing to hide, as if she, Ilara, his wife, the mother of his unborn children, had never existed. Time didn't just stop, it shattered. There were no screams, no dramatic gasps, just a deafening silence that roared inside her head. She felt her heart slowed to a dull, painful thud. Her eyes burned with unshed tears, her legs turned to water beneath her. The folded letter, with its now ridiculous words of love, slipped from her numb fingers and fluttered to the polished marble floor. A hotel employee, young and concerned, appeared at her side. "Ma'am, are you quite all right? You've gone terribly?" "Pale," he said, his voice muffled as if coming from very far away. He guided her to a plush velvet sofa as her vision began to tunnel. Pregnant and in shock, she could only let herself be led. Julian didn't see her. Or perhaps he did, and in that moment, chose to pretend he had not. That certainty, that deliberate ignoring of her very existence, was a pain sharper than any betrayal. She said not a word. She simply sat, letting the young man fetch her a glass of water she knew she could not drink. After a few minutes, a terrifying calm descended upon her. She stood up, thanked the employee with a voice that was not her own, and walked out of the hotel without looking back. The drive back to their penthouse was a blur of streetlights and silent tears. The home that was supposed to be their sanctuary now felt like a museum of broken promises. Every piece of art, every designer chair whispered of a love that was a lie. She didn't pack jewelry or the expensive dresses he loved to see her in. She went to the nursery, its pale yellow walls waiting for occupants who would now never know this life. From a small drawer, she took the sonogram image, the one where they'd first seen 2 tiny heartbeats, and a pair of impossibly small white booties she'd bought with a heart full of dreams. She packed simple clothes, her documents, and nothing. That bore his monogram. As the first hint of dawn painted the sky gray, Ilara closed the door to the penthouse for the last time. She paused for a moment on the threshold, a foolish part of her waiting for him to come running, to call her name, to explain it all away. The silence was her only answer. It was a farewell without noise, but with the immense crushing weight of a final sentence. The road to Seabrook was long, the landscape shifting from steel and glass to rolling hills, and finally the sharp, salt-kissed air of the coast. Seeing the familiar crooked sign for her hometown, with its modest cottages and lines of fishing boats, she felt a complex mix of relief and profound shame. It felt like a retreat, a admission of defeat. But deep beneath the pain, a new raw nerve was beginning to stir. It wasn't weakness that brought her back. It was a desperate, fledgling courage. The courage to start over. The courage to raise her daughters away from a love that had curdled into something poisonous her. Parents' cottage was exactly as she remembered it, the garden a little wilder, the blue paint on the door a little more faded. The door opened before she could even knock. Her mother, Marianne, took one look at her face, her swollen eyes, her trembling form, and opened her arms without a single question. The hug was tight, wordless, and it was the first thing that felt truly solid since her world had collapsed. "You're home, my darling," her mother whispered into her hair, her own voice thick with emotion. "You're home now?" The small bedroom at the back of the cottage still smelled faintly of the lavender sachets her grandmother used to make, and the sea air that seeped through the slightly warped window frame. For Alara, it was the scent of safety, of a time before her heart had learned how to break. The first few days in Seabrook were a blur of emotional exhaustion. She moved through the familiar rooms like a ghost, her body present but her spirit still trapped in that hotel lobby, watching her future disintegrate, despite the fierce affection. Of her parents, she carried a pain that could not be soothed with simple words. The abandonment was a physical weight on her chest, a constant aching presence. But the relentless, gentle routine of coastal life left little room for prolonged mourning. The sun rose early, and with it came the cry of gulls and the low hum of fishing boats heading out. There were meals to help prepare, the small room to air out. The overwhelming reality of her pregnancy seemed to accelerate in its final weeks, demanding her attention to keep her hands from shaking and her mind from spiraling into dark corners. She began to help her mother in the small flower shop attached to the cottage, the Marigold Cottage. It was a cramped, wonderful space, overflowing with color and life. Her mother, Marianne, wisely gave her simple, repetitive tasks. Alara's fingers, which had once been accustomed to handling delicate china and fine stationery, now learned to strip thorns from rose stems and bunch lavender into tight, fragrant bundles. One afternoon, while sorting through a delivery, she found a box of forgotten blooms, slightly past their prime for bouquets, but still beautiful in their fading state. On an impulse, she took them to the small work table. She found some old frames, scraps of velvet, and spools of silk thread. With a focus that bordered on meditation, she began to arrange the dried flowers, pressing them against the glass, creating a silent, fragile world of preserved beauty. She lost track of time, her entire being concentrated on the placement of a sprig of baby's breath, the curl of a fern. "Oh, my love," her mother said softly from the doorway, not wanting to startle her. "That's just beautiful. You have your great aunt's hands?" She could make magic with bits and pieces everyone else threw away. Alara looked up, her eyes meeting her mother's for the first time without a veil of tears. It wasn't a smile of forgetting, but the faint, tentative smile of someone discovering a new path through the ruins. Perhaps here among the petals and the thorns, she could begin to stitch together the roots of a new life, a life built not on luxury and empty promises, but on the simple, solid foundations of love, work, and quiet dignity. Word began to spread through the small town. Carmen's girl, back from the city, had a rare touch. Women from the parish started bringing her old frames, asking for a keepsake from a wedding bouquet or a special piece for a daughter's birthday. Her name was spoken with a soft respect. She was no longer just Julian Thorne's wife. She was becoming Ilara Vance, the artist, the flower girl. Despite the backaches and the swollen feet, she discovered a new strength within herself. It was not the imposing strength of wealth and power, but the resilient, stubborn strength of a wildflower growing through cracked stone. She was being rebuilt, one fragile, beautiful arrangement at a time. Then one night, the change began. A late summer storm was brewing over the ocean, the air thick and heavy. Alara, exhausted after a long day filling orders, felt a strange, persistent pressure low in her back, a deep heat that had nothing to do with the humid air. As she lay in her childhood bed, a sudden, intense pain seized her, sharp and undeniable, followed by a warm rush that left no doubt. Her eyes widened in the dark. The girls were coming, and they were early. Her father, Robert, a man of few words, but immediate action, ran through the lashing rain to fetch the local midwife, Mrs. D. Croft. Her mother held her hand, wiping her brow with a cool cloth, her whispered prayers mixing with the howl of the wind. It was a scene from another century, full of raw, primal effort and unwavering faith. The labor was long and arduous. The twins, impatient yet hesitant, were not positioned well. Ilara screamed into the storm, her cries echoing the thunder. Each wave of pain tearing through not just her body, but all the accumulated sorrow and fear. In that moment, Julian's absence was a palpable, cruel ghost. She didn't wish for him, but the injustice of it, all of bringing their children into the world alone, cut. Deeper than any physical pain, Mrs. Croft's hands were firm and capable. "Breathe, my girl. You are stronger than you know." These two are eager to meet their brave mother. After hours that felt like days, a powerful, indignant cry cut through the storm's fury. The first Flora entered the world with a head of dark hair and a pair of lungs that promised a strong will. Fawn took her time, arriving paler, more serene, her cry a softer, melodic sound. When Mrs. Croft placed them both in her arms, Ilara finally broke. Not tears of pain, but a flood of pure, overwhelming love. Ow! A love so vast it filled every empty space that betrayal and abandonment had carved inside her. They were small, but perfect. Flora had a determined little frown, even in sleep. Fawn's long fingers curled around Ilara's thumb with a surprising strength. She looked at them, her daughters, and knew with absolute certainty that every loss had led her to this moment, to this fierce, unbreakable love. For them, she would face anything. As the storm finally passed, revealing a clean, star-dusted sky, Ilara, now a mother, held her daughters and watched the dawn break over the sea. She was different. The silence in the penthouse was a physical presence, a heavy, suffocating blanket that smothered all sound and life. Julian stood in the vast, open-plan living area, the city lights twinkling far below, like a carpet of fallen stars. This view had once made him feel like a king surveying his kingdom. Now it only emphasized his isolation, a beautiful prison suspended in the sky. The grandeur of the apartment, with its curated art and minimalist furniture, felt cold and sterile. A showroom for a life that had vanished. The first day he had expected her anger. He had braced for the storm of phone calls, the furious texts, the dramatic confrontation. He had rehearsed his explanations, his justifications. It was a moment of weakness. It meant nothing. The stress of the impending fatherhood, the distance. He trusted in his own charm and the gravitational pull of the luxurious life he provided. He believed, with the unshakable arrogance of a man who had never truly been denied, that she would forgive him. Every woman forgave eventually, didn't they? But the phone never rang. No message lit up his screen. The silence stretched from hours into days, a void where her presence should have been. His pride curdled into unease, then into a low, thrumming anxiety. "She's overreacting," he told the empty room, his voice echoing off the cold marble. "She just needs time to cool off." He buried himself in work, in meetings that blurred into one another. In corporate dinners where he smiled and shook hands and heard nothing that was said to him, his mind was a broken record, stuck on a loop. That last image of her he'd conjured, hurt and waiting for him at home. Weeks bled into a month. The investigator he'd hired discreetly provided a single, frustrating report. Mrs. Thorne had withdrawn a modest sum of cash and vanished. No credit card usage, no flight manifests, no trace. The man suggested broader, more invasive searches, but Julian, gripped by a sudden, sharp shame, had called it off. The thought of forcing his way back into her life felt like another violation. A part of him, the part that was finally beginning to wake up, feared what he would find. Feared that she truly finally wanted nothing to do with him. Scarlett, the mistress, had sensed the shift in him almost immediately. The charming, powerful man was gone, replaced by a distracted, brooding shell. She'd made a few half-hearted attempts to console him before realizing his emotional well was not just dry, but cracked and empty. She disappeared from his life, as quickly as she had entered it, leaving behind a faint trace of expensive perfume and the bitter understanding that it had never been about him, only about the reflection of his power. The nights were the worst. He would wander the 2 quiet rooms, a glass of whiskey hanging from his fingers, untouched. He'd stop before photographs frozen in happier times. Their wedding day on a windswept beach in Cornwall, her laughing as He tried to build a sandcastle, a video of her trying to teach him to bake, both of them covered in flour. He missed the sound of her laughter, the way she would gently mock his extravagance, the simple comfort of her head on his shoulder during quiet evenings. Regret did not come in a crashing wave, but in a slow, constant drip. Each memory a drop that eroded his defenses until he felt hollowed out. One night, drawn by a pain he could no longer suppress, he pushed open the door to the nursery. The room was exactly as she had left it. A single, beautiful crib stood against a wall painted a soft, calming seafoam green. The color of the ocean? At Seabrook, she had said, her voice full of excitement. It will calm their souls. On a shelf sat 2 identical stuffed rabbits, still wrapped in cellophane. He sank to the floor, his back against the crib, and finally allowed the tears to come. They were not elegant or quiet. They were ugly, wrenching sobs that shook his entire frame. He was not crying for the loss of a wife, but for the loss of the man he could have been, the father, the partner, the decent human being. He had traded it all for a moment of ego-stroking emptiness. The world outside continued to spin. Newspapers ran profiles on his latest acquisition, calling him a visionary. Associates clapped him on the back, envying his empire. But in the lavender-scented silence of that unused nursery, Alexander Julian Thorne was forced to face the truth. He was a bankrupt man, and he was terrified it was far too late to ever become solvent again. The gilded cage he had built for himself had no lock on the door, but he found he had nowhere left to fly. The relentless energy of the city, once a tonic to his ambition, had become a grating noise. His performance at work had grown distracted, his decisions hesitant. His business partner, a shrewd man named Albright, had finally pulled him aside. After a meeting where Julian had stared blankly at a multi-million-dollar projection, "Julian, you're not here. Go find wherever here is for you now. Sort it out. The company needs you present, not this ... ghost. It was a forced sabbatical, wrapped in the language of concern. With no battle to fight in the boardroom, his mind turned inward to the only front that mattered. The investigator's old report mentioned a coastal town, Seabrook, where her parents had once lived. It was a thin thread, but the only one he had. He manufactured a Rezena, potential investment in coastal properties, a new boutique hotella. Flimsy excuse, he repeated to himself, to justify the hope and terror warring in his chest. The drive to Seabrook was a journey into another world. The steel and glass canyons of the city gave way to rolling hills, then to the flat, salt marsh landscapes of the coast. The air that filtered through his car's vents changed, carrying the temps of the sea and the damp smell of earth. Willow Creek, the town she had sometimes described with a nostalgic smile, was not a place of glamour. It was a place of essence, of weathered wood and hardy flowers, of dirt roads and honest smiles. He got out of his car, his tailored suit suddenly, feeling like a costume. He was an actor who had wandered onto the wrong stage, stood in the central square, taking in the old bandstand. The fishing nets draped over a fence to dry, the sound of children laughing. And then fate, or perhaps karma, decided to speak in. The distance, under the dappled shade of an ancient oak tree, he saw her Alara. She was sitting on a simple wooden bench, but she seemed to be sitting on a throne of quiet confidence. She wore a simple sundress, her skin glowing with a health he hadn't seen in years. And in her arms, on her lap, were 2 little girls. They were a riot of dark curls and sunshine, one babbling animatedly to a teddy bear, the other carefully, placing a chain of dandelions on her mother's knee. Time stopped. His breath caught in his throat. His legs felt unsteady. It was as if every cell in his body was screaming, pulling him toward them, yet his soul was anchored in a swamp of shame. He recognized them instantly. They had her eyes. It's the same deep, soulful brown, full of curiosity and light. They were his daughters. The daughters he had never held, whose first cries he had not heard, whose lives he had abandoned before they even began. Yaller looked up, her laughter fading as her gaze swept the square and landed on him. To shock, then solidified into something hard and impenetrable. She froze for a second, Then her arms tightened around the girl's protectively. Her heart, he could see even from a distance, was hammering against her chest. He took a hesitant, involuntary step forward. It was a plea, a question. Her eyes answered with a clear, cold warning. "Don't you dare. Flora Fawn, time to go home," she said, her voice firm, though he could see the tremor in her hands as she gathered their things. The girls, confused by the sudden end to their play, obeyed. As they walked away, one of them, Fawn, the quieter one, turned and looked back. At him, she offered a small, innocent wave, a universal gesture of childlike curiosity. That simple, unknowing gesture shattered what was left of his heart. He stood rooted to the spot for long minutes, the world moving around him in a blur. He finally stumbled to the bench she had just vacated, the wood still warm from her body. He pulled out his phone, his hands shaking, and scrolled to an old photo. It was Alara, holding the positive pregnancy test, her eyes shining with tears. Of joy, a radiant, disbelieving smile on her face. "They're mine," he whispered to the empty air, his voice cracking under the weight of the truth. He had not just lost a wife, he had forfeited a family. The following days, he didn't leave. He checked into a small, sparse inn on the edge of town, a world away from his 5-star suites. He began a routine of quiet observation. He saw her in the mornings, walking with the girls to a small flower shop attached to a cottage. He saw her work in the garden, her hands deep in the soil, the twins playing at her feet. He saw the way the townspeople greeted her with genuine warmth and respect. One afternoon, driven by a need that outweighed his fear, he approached the cottage. The door to the workshop was open, the sound of a sewing machine and childish giggles. Spilling out, he knocked softly. Ella appeared, Fawn balanced on her hip. The easy smile she wore vanished the instant she saw him, replaced by a mask of cold stone. Her eyes, those beautiful eyes he had loved, were like flint. Julian. His name was a statement, not a greeting.
"Alara, please."
I want to talk, to see them.
To try.
"And you want to try?" She cut him off, her voice low and sharp. She set Fawn down in a playpen near a work table littered with dried flowers and fabric. "You destroyed us. You betrayed me when I was most vulnerable. You left me to give birth alone. They grew for a year without knowing your name, and now you appear and think you can just try." Each word was a hammer blow. He had no defense. "I was scared. I thought you hated me, that you'd never want to see me again." "And you were right," she said, her voice trembling with contained fury. "I built this," she gestured around the small, thriving workshop, "without you. With pain. And anger, but with my own 2 hands. I won't let you stroll back in here now that remorse has decided to pay you a visit." He looked down, defeated. "Let me just see them, know their names." "They're happy," she stated, her tone final. "They are growing up loved, without knowing what it's like to have a father who disappears. They will continue to be fine with or without you." She held the door open, a clear dismissal. He left without another word, the sun outside feeling cold and harsh on his skin. He had asked for forgiveness and been shown the door. He understood, with a crushing clarity, that words were the cheapest currency here. He would have to earn a hearing with something far more valuable. The uninvited rain began not from the sky, but from a small, fuzzy bumblebee buzzing lazily amongst the lavender bushes in the cottage garden. It was a sweltering afternoon, the air thick and heavy with the scent of blossoms and salt. Flora and Fawn, now sturdy toddlers with a shared spirit of adventure, were playing a game of chase, their laughter weaving through the flower beds. Ilara was inside, preparing a pitcher of lemonade, her mind pleasantly occupied with a new design for a client's anniversary. A sharp, piercing scream shattered the peaceful hum of the day. It was not a cry of playful surprise, but one of pure, unadulterated terror. Ilara's heart seized. She ran outside, her blood turning to ice. Flora stood frozen, pointing. Fawn was on the ground, her body rigid, her face swelling rapidly into a grotesque mask, her breath coming in thin, desperate whistles. Her skin was clammy, her eyes wide with a panic she was too young to understand. The world narrowed to a single, terrifying point. Ilara snatched her daughter up, screaming for her father. Robert ran from his shed, his face ashen. Allergic reaction. We need to get to the clinic. Now. But his old truck was blocked by a delivery van, and the nearest hospital was a 30-minute drive on winding coastal roads. The first time since returning to Seabrook, Ilara felt a wave of utter paralyzing helplessness. And then he was there. Julian, who had taken to walking the perimeter of the town just to feel closer to them, heard the commotion and sprinted towards the cottage. He took in the scene in an instant. Ilara's terrified face, the child's struggling form, Robert's desperation. He didn't hesitate, didn't ask questions. "My car, now, it's just there," he commanded, his voice astonishingly calm. He gently but firmly took Fawn from Ilara's trembling arms. "I'll drive. You hold her." The drive to the hospital was a blur of screeching tires and prayed promises. Julian drove with a fierce, focused intensity, navigating the treacherous curves, with a skill born of necessity. In the passenger seat, Ilara held her daughter, whispering desperate pleas, her tears falling onto Fawn's feverish skin. Julian's eyes kept flicking to the rearview mirror, not to the road behind, but to the two of them. His jaw clenched with a fear that was entirely selfless. At the small county hospital, he didn't park. He screeched to a halt at the emergency. Entrance flung his door open and ran inside with Fawn in his arms, shouting for a doctor. He was no longer a polished CEO. He was a father, wild-eyed and desperate, his expensive shirt stained with his daughter's tears and his own sweat. He stayed by her side until the medical team swarmed in, his hand briefly brushing Ilara's in a gesture of shared terror. Hours later, the sterile, quiet hallway, a doctor emerged to tell them the crisis had passed. A severe bee sting allergy. Fawn was sedated, stable, and would be fine. The relief that washed over Ilara was so profound her legs gave way. Julian caught her, his arms strong around her, holding her up as she sobbed into his shoulder. They sank onto a hard plastic bench. Together, the adrenaline receding, leaving them both shaking. If something had happened to her... Julian whispered, his own voice ragged with emotion, "And I hadn't been here. I wouldn't have survived it." Lara looked at him then, truly looked at him. She saw the fear still etched around his eyes, the genuine anguish, the utter lack of pretense. He had acted without a single thought for himself. He had been their rock in the storm, not because he wanted to earn points, but because he loved them. It was the answer to the question she had been too afraid to ask. The man who had run away from responsibility was gone. In his place was a man who would run straight into a fire for them. "You were here," she said, her voice hoarse. "You only thought of her that... That is what I needed to see." He didn't reply. He simply took her hand, and this time she didn't pull away. They sat in the humming silence of the hospital corridor, side by side, two survivors of a long emotional war, and in that moment, a new truce was silently declared. The sun rose the next morning over a world that felt subtly changed. In the garden of the Marigold Cottage, a simple arch had been woven with flowering jasmine and sprigs of lavender. A few chairs were arranged on the grass. It was not a wedding, but a renewal. A promise. Elara walked to him on the grass, not in a white gown, but in a simple ivory dress she had embroidered herself with tiny intertwined flowers. Flora and Fawn, in little linen dresses, carried rings tied with ribbons on a small wicker tray. Julian waited for her, his eyes clear, his love for her and their daughters shining from him with an honesty that needed no words. When she reached him, he took her hands. "I lost you because I was a fool," he said, his voice steady and soft. "I found my way back by learning how to love. I promise to be present, to be a root, not just a shadow. To deserve the trust you're placing in me today, every single day." Ilara squeezed his hands, her eyes bright with tears that were no longer bitter. "I loved you with my whole heart. I lost you to my pride. And today, I choose you with my eyes wide open. I promise to build a future with you, not on the past we had, but on the man you've become." As they exchanged simple bands, Flora, ever the pragmatist, tugged on her mother's dress. "So now you and Daddy both live here, forever?" Ilara knelt, pulling both her daughters into a tight embrace, Julian's hand resting on her shoulder, completing the circle. "Yes, my darling," she whispered, her voice full of a joy she thought she'd lost forever. "Now we are all together." And there in her garden of second chances, surrounded by the fragile, enduring beauty she had cultivated with her own hands, the past finally released its grip. Love had not simply returned. It had been replanted, tended to, and had blossomed into something stronger, deeper, and more resilient than it had ever been before. It was finally completely whole.